Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick introduction and a quick overview of the of today's agenda, and then hand over to my speakers. We have a nice agenda today. I hope you will enjoy it. So as ever, we are going to do a quick update on our current development work. We are going to focus on the major features we're working on machine actionable features. Don is going to give a more in-depth overview of a couple of features and some issues that have popped up while we were doing development work. Marta's going to give the general overview. You're then going to have the opportunity to ask questions. We take a 10-minute coffee break at 10 minutes past 11. We don't have to stop if you don't want to, but I find it's always useful. Then Joy is going to give us a talk on planning for FAIR data. I think she will explain this much better than me, but this is in the context of us revising our data management templates. I'll explain what I mean by this just before Joy starts. You will then have the opportunity to have a discussion. I'm really looking forward to an active discussion on this because it's an important topic. And then, as ever, I'll give a quick overview and we stop. Please take part, ask questions, because it's an important topic. Okay, so we can now hand over to Marta, who is going to do a quick overview of our development work. Marta, you take over.
Thank you, Diana. So I'm just going to hope everyone is well. I'm just going to do a brief update on our current development. So machine actionable grants ID is being done by Don, and so far what we have done with this is we're looking to how can we integrate research information from a funder using a grant ID. In order to do that, Don created a proof of concept initially, which we have presented to actually our DMP toolie team, which is the kind of sister in a way of the DMPonline tool in Finland. The proof of concept was to allow a researcher to enter the grant ID and then go and find additional information available for that particular project. So far, we had a meeting with the DMP toolie and they gave us feedback. And what we are now in the process, or what Don is now in the process, is to create a second interaction of it, which will be available in the end of the month. One of the nice things about this initial integration is that it's going to be design in order to be at the template level, which allows multiple grants IDs repositories to be available depending on the actual template being used. Diana, do you want to move to the next slide, please? Excuse me.
Seems to have frozen.
Okay.
Don't worry, it's moving. It's a bit slow. Go ahead.
So the DOI's research outputs. This is a GLENASS project. So GLENASS is looking into finding ways to, based on a DOI, be able to integrate metadata. Initially was in just by 4 data sets, but we're now looking into other types of research outputs. And for that, it might mean using different sources for the DOIs the researcher to fetch the information. This means we're looking at what's the best available kind of repository where with all the more DOIs available in order to allow the researcher to integrate. This will bring information from the research outputs into DMP. So it's another way to gather information in your DMP. There's been a combination of the kind of discussion, and at the moment Glenys is designing the kind of feature specification. So, but we're hoping that will be completed soon as well. Diana, do you want to go to the next one, please? So question IDs. This is me, and the idea behind this is to design identifiers that will allow org admin to integrate some additional information in the template that then will provide the API with additional mapping for extracting that question. So in the API v0, you can gather the answers and questions for each plan. And what we're trying to implement is a pair of identifiers that will allow the universities to extract a specific answer or a specific question, and obviously its answer. This was suggested by us by DMP Toolie, and we are already in the process of implementing it. We're hoping that in the next week we'll have proof of concept, which means it will be ready for testing in our development service. This will be available to all organizations if they see fit to actually use it. But yeah, so this is kind of an additional mapping and making the API v0 slightly more flexible for research for the organizations. And then finally, Diana, do you want to move to the next one? We have other projects that are still are in process as well, they're in development as well, which is the research organization registry, so ROR. This is to allow a new user to be able to select a non-existing organization from our table and adding this new organization to the actual DMPonline. Then we have an integration with RSpace, which is going really well and should be actually it should allow the researcher to be able to export, in a way, if we put it this way. So with research with RSpace the information, and then finally we are redesigning and creating a new discovery service for our single sign-on, which is Don, who is looking into this as well. Now, I will be passing it to Don because he's going to give a brief description, sorry, of some of his work, and he's going to talk about it a little bit more in detail of some of the single sign-on discovery service as well. So that's me. Thank you.
Cool. So I'll share my screen.
Yeah, you can share your screen after Google Docs. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Yes, so I'm going to just continue what Marta covered just then. Sorry, going to cover some operational updates to DMPonline. Sorry, let's just expand that a bit. So part one will be the new discovery service for single sign-on in DMPonline, and part two will be this minor update to the DMPonline v1 API. So yeah, so first of all, part one, new discovery service for SSO and DMPonline. This only impacts DMPonline and not DMP Toolie or DMP Melbourne, because they have their own discovery services for single sign-on. So as you know, in the current single sign-on, the user will go to DMPonline. Let's bring up, yeah, just here. The user clicks on sign in with your institutional credentials, and at this point, the user is taken to this the UK Federation Central Discovery Service. This step here. So at this point, you'd look up your institution and click through to it. And then authenticate. So yeah, I'll just do that. Okay, it's hang in there. So anyway, so it is this step that will be changing. Okay, I think it's remembered me from previous session. So it'll be this step that is changing. So this is due to the UK Federation will be closing their Central Discovery Service on Thursday, the 29th February, so next month. And the UK Federation recommends that each service set up their own embedded discovery service. And so this is what we've done for DMPonline. And I'll just show you how that will look. So this is just in our development environment, as you can see from the URL. So this step is the same. So sign in with your institutional credentials. You're then taken to our DMPonline discovery service and just enter in your organization. Then you're taken to your organization, just authenticate. And then you're in DMPonline. So that's the only difference. That it's just that discovery service. It's changing from being run by the UK Federation to being run by us. So a small change. So some of the benefits of the embedded discovery service is that I'll just go back to the page. Yes, is that you see the consistent branding. As users, you see the consistent branding that the Edinburgh embedded discovery service uses DMPonline theme and styling and so on. And also we don't have any adverts, which is unfortunately what the UK Federation had in their central discovery service. So an ad-free zone, which is good. So part 2 is this update to the V1 API. So we found that in the response to when you call the V1 API in the response, specifically in this path here. So if you go to items, DMP, DMP ID, identifier, that identifier is the URL of the particular plan for the API. So when you're calling the API and you want to get that specific plan, this is the URL that you would, the endpoint that you would call. We discovered that it was being generated with an HTTP protocol instead of being generated with the HTTPS protocol. So that means that if you call this URL, it would fail even if you have the correct authentication. So the change is that we'll just be updating this so that now when you call the API, this protocol will be HTTPS. And that means that when you do call this URL, if you do call it, you'll get a successful response. So very small change, but we just wanted to make you aware of it. Yeah, okay. And that's it. That's me. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so to do a quick summary, you all got it, yeah? So for grant ID, we have a demo. We have a demo of the machine actionable grant ID. We insert a grant number, it retrieves certain details, other details for the plan, and it automatically fills them in. For DOIs, for use of digital object identifiers, we are looking for the best API at the moment. If you have suggestions for that, we think we found it, but it may take a while. If you have suggestions for that, please feel free to approach us. For question IDs, we're currently coding. ROR, integration with ROR, we're still finishing the specification. And RSpace, I think that's more or less working. So RSpace can retrieve DMPs from DMPonline. But while we were doing that, it turns out that we needed to do an adjustment to API, to our API version 1, apologies, and Don is working on that. And he's just demonstrated the solution. I hope this makes sense. Now we have time for questions. And I see Joachim had his hand raised for a while, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering if the new SSO login will affect the URLs that we use. We have our own URL, dmp@.su.se. So can we still use that? And it will take us to the login site page.
Yes, so there won't be any changes to the URLs of the tenants, of your individual tenant. There is a change to, obviously, because it's different embedded discovery service to the UK Federation, that URL is different, but that's taken care of behind the scenes. So you'll still start in your tenant URL, your tenant page, go to single sign-on, and then you'll be returned to your tenant page.
Okay.
So I don't think there are any impact there.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, next question. I see Chris, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Sorry, just had to unmute. Thanks very much. Just a question about the RAW.
Yeah.
How will the RAW be added to user profiles? Will this be the responsibility of the users, or will this be automated?
Integration with ROR is when the organization field is machine actionable, and it's not the user's responsibility. The only responsibility the user will have really is to attach themselves to an organization, but that's in their profile, right? When they edit their profile. But the integration with ROR is not, it has nothing to do with, it's not the user's responsibility. It's, if you like, our responsibility to make sure the users can select all organizations by making the organization field machine actionable. It's not the user's responsibility, really. Marta, if I've said anything wrong, please go ahead.
No, basically for the end user, there's not going to be any difference. It's more in when you're creating an account, instead of having just our list of organizations, you're given a worldwide list pretty much, so you can pick any of them. And if it's the one that is not in our list, we'll just add it then. So it's kind of a controlled way to enter a new organization into our system. And it will work as well when you're adding a collaborator, because it could be a case that, you know, so it's the principles as it's a situation. Is it a person who's not already belonging to an organization in the system? Then we'll add the organization. It just makes it slightly more smooth for the end user. It's the idea, but to be honest, you won't see any difference. It's all behind scenes.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks. And sorry, just one very quick follow-up. Thinking about the question IDs, presumably that'll work across not just the standard template, but if an organization chooses to add a section to a template, then would the question ID function still work for that section as well?
Yes, so the idea is that any template that you have, every time you create a template, or if you're customizing a template, it will give you the possibility to add the identifiers. They need to be unique to the template, but only to the template. And that means you can go into each question and make a change, and then you can share. It will give you the list of those IDs, and you can share it with the IT department who is extracting the data. It's just more to give you an additional control over the actual questions present. So that's the principle behind it.
Lovely. Thanks very much indeed.
Please.
Okay. Is any...
Diana
Go ahead.
Petra has a question in the chat.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. There are questions on the actual agenda, by the way, which you need to address.
Oh.
Chris, are you keeping your hand up?
Oh.
No, don't worry.
Sorry,
I just need it. Okay. I can see. Oh, I can see lots of questions in the chat. Okay, let's see. So, Petra, do we need to change something because we have an automatic login via ServConnects? All right, so this is to do with the discovery service. Don, do you want to address this?
Yeah, is ServConnects, is that what's used for DMP tooling?
It's like
No.
JISC. Yeah, no, sorry. This is like you know how JISC responsible for UK Federation is responsible for the UK gathering. SurfNet is the one for Sweden. No, sorry. Yeah, Sweden.
No, it's the Netherlands.
Netherlands. Sorry.
Okay.
I
It's
just like a countrywide one.
Yeah,
Thank
it was
sorry,
just
Petra.
done that after you typed in your institute, then you had to type in your username and password again, and we don't do that because ServConnects automatically logs us in with our institutional credentials. So I was just wondering if we need to change something or that it will just be as usual.
The way it works is we gather that information. So UK Federation gathers that information from SurfNet. So we ourselves don't tend to do anything. So it's just the way that UK Federation is still going to provide us the base data per se.
Yeah.
It's so it's an API. So basically, it will still be coming through them. It's just it not providing the discovery service. So, but Don can explain a bit more. But I don't think he realized that it was coming that way.
Yeah,
I knew that. Sorry to interrupt, Don.
No, it's fine. So does that mean the tenants from the Netherlands have not been using the UK Federation Discovery Service so far?
Yeah, no, they have. So the way
They
it
have?
works
Oh,
is
okay.
UK Federation gathers worldwide all the data. Sorry, I should have mentioned this to you. Sorry, this is a bit of conversation. But yeah, so basically gathers through. That's why so people like Petra who are using DMPonline, they kind of reroute it through UK Federation through there. But because we're still getting our data from UK Federation, we get it's not just UK, it's worldwide information passed on. So I'm assuming everything should continue the same. But what we could probably do is get you to test, Petra, so you could actually have a go and we'll be able to visualize if there's any problem. But as far as I'm aware, I'm not expecting anything to be an issue.
No. That would be really nice to check here just in advance if everything works. Thanks for the offer.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think our single sign-on services is needs serious improvement. But the short answer is, as far as I can tell, you don't need to make any change. Don, please look into this and speak to Petra. Yeah. Thank you so much. Now, this one is Andres Ramos Padilla. So for the DOI in the research outputs, will this automatically read the metadata information and put it in the DMP? Yeah, that's why we're spending so much time researching the right API. Gladys, do you want to add information onto this?
Yes, Diana, I've actually already answered in the chat. We've had a small conversation, but just for others as well. Yes, this the plan is to have it automatically retrieve metadata from the DOI so that either while creating a research output or when you come back to edit or update it, you will be able to just click a button and retrieve the metadata. So yes, it is for the creation stage. I think Andreas wanted to know if it is for the creation part as well. So yes, it is.
Okay, in that case, Joy, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen and go ahead with your presentation.
So hi everyone. It's nice to be back at one of the DMPonline user group meetings. It's been a very long time since I've been at one of these. I see a lot of familiar names in this, so it's nice to see you all again in the DCC context and not in some of the other European projects. So today, what I wanted to do was just to run through quickly planning for FAIR data and to talk a little bit about the FAIR principles and to understand a little bit about how we might be able to start to think about how we can use the DMPonline tool to better think about integration points for support over the life cycle. So we'll start with a brief presentation today. I'm going to go over a little bit about RDM, FAIR, and open, some of the drivers for FAIR, a few practical messages about making data fair, and then I wanted to move on to those kind of discussions where we can start to think about potential trigger points to really think about incremental support over the life of a research project. So apologies to many of you in the audience. I know that a lot of you are already expert in the FAIR principles and are delivering training at your own institutions on this and more broadly, but you probably can switch it off if you're bored at this point or go and grab a coffee. But I just wanted to kind of maybe touch on some of these points for people who might be newer to the FAIR principles and just want to get a better sense of what's covered. So first and foremost, what are the FAIR principles? They are a nice set of principles that have been around since 2016. Basically, they stand for data that are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think basically, it's very hard for anybody to argue with those principles that research data, especially those that are produced through public funding, are indeed fair. I think what does become more difficult is that the NICE acronym does break down into some more concrete actions. And I won't go into all of the sub kind of principles here. You can delve into them as deeply as you'd like. But essentially what you need to kind of get your head around is the fact that FAIR really depends on the use of persistent identifiers that are globally unique. We need to have very rich metadata, and that we need to have that in both a structured way that allows humans and machines to understand it. But we also need to work towards interoperability. And again, this is making use of things like thesauri and controlled vocabularies and ontologies. We also need to make sure that we are following more things to do with licensing and making clear what people can and can't do with data that they are finding, and wherever possible, sticking to open standards. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more, I've put a link here to a tool that was developed in one of the European Commission funded projects called FAIR. And it's a kind of self-assessment tool for researchers, but also for support staff. And if you're interested to learn a little bit more about FAIR in a practical sense and what each of these sub principles mean, you can have a look at that and maybe share it with your researchers. One of the other things I wanted to focus on in the early part of today is just to clarify that there's a lot of misconceptions that FAIR data is the same as open data. So I just wanted to put up this definition of open data from the ODI. And again, it makes clear that fully open data is something that anybody can come and use for any purpose. And that could include using it for commercial purposes. So that is definitely not what we're saying FAIR data is. FAIR data does acknowledge that you can have data closed for very good reasons, whether that's because the information is commercially or personally sensitive. There may be very good reasons for not sharing. What the FAIR principles does encourage, though, is even that in cases where data can't be shared more openly, there's generally a good case for making sure that the metadata describing it is fair, so that people can at least know that the data has been collected and that it exists, and have some idea about how to request legitimate access if that is something that can happen. Where we want to kind of move to is this ideal scenario where we have FAIR data, where everything's really well described and have lots of good persistent identifiers attached, and that we're using open standards, and this kind of notion of open data. And I think it's just trying to make sure that people understand neither of these are binary concepts. FAIR data, there can be degrees of fairness, and open data, there can be degrees of openness. So we're trying to move to this ideal where we're having fair and open data. That's the ultimate. Oh, jumped quite a far bit ahead here. I'm not sure why. Go back up. So when you're talking to researchers, I think open data can sometimes be a bit of a hard sell, and I'm sure many of you who've been doing this for a long time are aware of this challenge. When you're talking to people about managing their research data, it's often an easier sell because they do understand that well-managed data means that they can stand up to scrutiny. If somebody asks questions about findings, they're able to back up what they've said in their paper with well-managed data. So people can understand that concept. Open seems to be a benefit to somebody else in most cases, even though there are lots of studies trying to show that open data can lead to real-world benefits for both the researchers and the people benefiting from the open data. FAIR data sits somewhere in between. So again, it's that kind of step beyond just managing your data well and trying to really improve the description and the context and providing those persistent identifiers to the data. If you choose to make it open, then obviously that's one step further, but it's just trying to help people understand. It kind of sits more towards that bottom level as well, where you do get benefits from it yourself. So if your data is fair, you will be more able to stand up to scrutiny and support research integrity. Just want to move on to a couple of drivers now. And again, just as I mentioned there, FAIR data does support research integrity. And I think it's worth mentioning that this is quite a hot topic right now in the UK. So we have the UK Reproducibility Network. But similarly, there's a lot of work going on in Europe around this theme. So it is something that people will be keen to support. In codes of research practice, we see a lot about research integrity and reproducibility. So even if researchers don't necessarily want to engage with open science, by and large, they understand the reasons for research integrity and reproducibility. And that may be a better way to hook them into wanting to make their data fair. The other driver that we have is that funders still do have expectations around FAIR data. We've had expectations for many years around developing DMPs. Many funders, and this is an example from the European Commission, many funders are now including references to FAIR data. So they want data management plans that will lead to the production and sharing of FAIR data. So that's another good reason for doing it and getting people on board. The last example here I just wanted to include is something called the European Open Science Cloud. And for most of you who are working in Europe, I'm sure you're very familiar with this concept, but it is essentially a big investment in the European Commission and broadly across Europe to develop this shared infrastructure where FAIR data can be shared and reused. So the entire vision of the European Open Science Cloud really depends on the availability of FAIR data. So this is something that is a really kind of central area of work going on in the European Commission, and the DCC is actually involved in 3 projects that have been working to realize the development of the European Open Science Cloud. The first is FAIR, which finished in 2022. And we're involved in 2 that are ongoing at the moment. One is FAIR Impact, which will run until 2025. And the other is Skills for EOSC, and it similarly will finish in 2025. So just a bit out there on the drivers and what FAIR means. But I mean, hopefully it's clear to everybody. I think we're all kind of converted to the ideas of open science and data sharing. But again, you know, FAIR data doesn't just happen. It requires planning and active research data management over the entire life cycle. So this diagram, I'm sure you've seen many, many times. I'm sure we've used it many times in previous DMP user groups, but it is this kind of life cycle. And many of the themes we cover in the DMP do relate to FAIR, and it's just trying to think, how can we better make sure that these things are linked up. I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about some practical messages for making data fair. These will be very high level, but just to give people a few ideas of how this can happen in practice. I think for most people, the best thing you can encourage researchers to do is to make use of a data repository. And this obviously solves quite a few of the problems, so it will help them to get that unique global persistent identifier, whether it's a DOI or similar. It also means that people will be able to adhere to some sort of metadata standards. So the different data repositories will generally have some standard that they're using. And most of these will be kind of globally recognized standards. And I think it's good for people to be able to understand that they can make use of these. I think the other thing that's worth maybe flagging up here is that many of the funders are starting to talk about things called trustworthy repositories. And there's still a lot of debate going on in exactly what that means in a real sense. Some repositories are certified with Core Trust Seal or similar. And in many ways, you can assume that they are trustworthy to some degree. What trustworthy means in other kind of contexts is still a debate. If you're interested in this, I think there's many discussions going on at the European level. But it is just to make you aware that some funders are now encouraging the use of trustworthy or certified repositories to make FAIR data available. I think the other benefit of using a repository is that there will be a data catalog associated with the data holdings. And this just means that the data can be found if somebody's looking for it, and that they get that description in a standard machine readable way that they can start to make decisions about what data is available and what they might want to reuse or avoid duplicating. When we're talking to researchers, we generally give them the kind of 3 options when they're choosing a repository. The first preferred option is always to go with domain-specific repository if one exists, because generally there will be domain-specific metadata that is used, and you'll get standards from that domain that are relevant to the researcher, and you can adhere to the community standard, and hopefully your data is added to a pool of domain-specific data. The second one is institutional. So obviously, if you have your own data repository, you may have requirements even to have a metadata record within your own institutional record. Even if the data is housed in a domain-specific repository, you may want to make those links. That can help with things like the ref activity that we've just been going through in the UK. And the third option is the generalist repositories, so your Zenodos and Figshare. And these are always great options if you don't have an institutional repository or a domain-specific option that you can choose. But you just want to make sure that people kind of go with domain-specific wherever possible, I think is the key message. One thing I wanted to flag up is the RE3 data. Registry of data repositories, and I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it. It's a great place to go and start looking for research repositories that might fit the bill. You can search on different parameters, so whether they offer licenses, whether they can assign persistent identifiers, and indeed you can start to look as to whether there are any kind of certificates or standards that are within the repository. There is work going on within the FAIR Impact project to try and make trustworthiness a little bit more transparent. That's a work in progress, and we'll maybe come back to you later to provide a bit more information on how that's going. One thing I did want to flag up here is that the RE3 data, as many people have already noticed, has been integrated into the DMPonline under the Research Outputs tab. So you can start to use this functionality in DMPs to try and identify where data might eventually end up. Providing these rich metadata descriptions, again, it's worth bearing in mind that when you're talking about uploading data to a data repository, the data is kind of at that stage where it's probably finalized, or at least in a fairly good point in its life cycle to be shared. At that point, you're quite far down the research life cycle. So, while you can provide really good, rich metadata descriptions at that upload stage to a repository, it's worth thinking about how you can also make sure that this is happening during the active stage of the life cycle, because capturing metadata is done best during the process, and it's often cheaper and easier to do it if it's done during the active stage of the life cycle rather than trying to come back and do it at the end. So try to remember, and I think the DMP templates also ask things about metadata and standards. So it's just trying to encourage people to think about this early on. One thing I think is possibly a good thing to think about is if somebody has said in their DMP that they're planning to use a particular metadata standard and they've identified a potential repository, it's worth just doing a check to make sure that they're compatible, just to avoid any extra work later. So having some of these early discussions is great, but I think we'll come back to this later on. How can we really start to help people to do this during the active stage and not just when they have something to deposit? And again, here, the key thing to ensure fairness is that the metadata has to be understandable by both humans and machines. So that aspect is something that's crucial. I mentioned earlier the use of vocabularies and ontologies can be really helpful for supporting interoperability. But again, these things tend to happen during the active stage. So you don't want to wait until you're at the end of a project to start introducing controlled vocabularies and ontologies. So again, how can we start to make sure that we can move from that initial outline DMP where people might say they're going to use particular vocabularies and ontologies, and then try to support that as it actually happens during the active phase of the life cycle. Persistent identifiers, as I mentioned, is a really crucial part of the FAIR principles. There are lots of different kinds of persistent identifiers available that can identify different kinds of outputs. So we have, research data, obviously, is one that we're all aware of. Publications, we're all aware of them, and being able to link between them is great. But we're also putting now an equal emphasis on things like research software. So if people have developed specific bits of code to do analysis during their research, that may also need to be considered, and you might want to make this FAIR as well. So the use of the persistent identifiers is really crucial in establishing those links between the different research outputs. So again, using things like DOIs. But as you've already heard in this discussions today, looking at ORCID and the RORs, these different kinds of identifiers help to build a bigger picture between the actors as well. So it can be the researchers through their ORCIDs, it could be their organizations that they're working for through the RORs. Equally, grant identifiers help to link it to particular funded activities. So really, the persistent identifiers are all about building up that contextual information and showing the relationships between different outputs. So it's worth taking the time to try and make those bi-directional links between the various outputs and trying to build that into the workflow. Again, you can sort of, you will get these things toward the end, obviously, with DOIs for publications and data sets. We've moved the ORCIDs and the RORs earlier into the life cycle through the DMP, but again, it's just trying to think, how can we support the application and use of these more consistently during the active stage as well. I wanted to kind of come back to this point that FAIR data can still be considered FAIR even if it's not something you can access. So again, we're all aware that there could be good reasons not to share the data. If you do have FAIR data, though, then there are many ways that you can think about sharing it. So there could be authentication processes in place. If you use particular repositories, people may have to go through a particular authentication to be able to access it, but the metadata should still be available for them to look at. We're also starting to see the use of safe havens, and I know some of the institutions in the UK, I think the University of Edinburgh has their own institutional data vault, and I think several others are in the position of setting these up so that, again, you can support access to restricted data. But again, for fairness to be, if you're looking to have FAIR data, even if the data can't be shared, you want to make that clear in the metadata. It should state any restrictions on access to data, and how you might go about requesting that legitimate access if that is possible. So the metadata should always be FAIR, even if the data can't be FAIR. As with all the advice we give to researchers, I think over the life of doing DMPs, we've tried to emphasize the fact that people don't have to think about every output that they're creating. You want them to put the effort into selected outputs. So they need to think as they're going through this, what needs my effort to be made FAIR, and more importantly, to be kept FAIR over time. So a lot of this will kind of help you to make those decisions about where the effort needs to be used. So helping people to think about what sort of outputs will have value, And again, you know, we were talking earlier about the fact that research data is one output, but you might have research software that is an integral part of that research output. And how would you make both of these things accessible for the longer term and keep them fair over time? So it's important to try and get people to think, we're not saying everything, but focus them into the right kinds of areas to focus on. And this last point here, focused in red, is to be fair, the metadata record. So even if you have data that you are retaining for a set period, you've got a consent form where you've said that you will get rid of the data after 10 years. You want to make sure that your metadata record is updated so that it says the data was destroyed after the 10-year mark in line with the retention period. So what you don't want are dead ends. So the metadata should always explain what has happened to the data, even if the data no longer exists. And that just keeps things fair over time. So those were just a couple of key messages about FAIR and how it all kind of fits together with data management planning. I think with the kinds of support services that we have, we are probably well placed to help people at the early stage. So when they're at the start of a research project, particularly if it's for funded research and they have to write a DMP, we can help them to start to think about some of these questions early on and hopefully give them some pointers and advice. But there's a lot of stuff that happens between that initial stage and the wrap up of a project when people might be uploading their data to various different repositories and their other outputs. So it's how then do we start to think about coming back and encouraging people to update their DMPs? And how can we start to think about maybe different trigger points over the life cycle to ensure that we can support the incremental fairness of the outputs over time? So I wanted to spend a bit of time, and I mean, maybe we can have the coffee break if you want to do that now, but I just wanted us to spend a few minutes just looking together to see if we can identify any different points in the research life cycle where we could start to think about natural check-in points. And I'm sure some of the service providers on the call today probably have things they're doing already, and it would just be good to share some of these for discussion. I also wanted to think about whether any of these trigger points might be linked to functionality within DMPonline. I think particularly with the new research outputs tab and the potential there to try and make that a sort of inventory of outputs over the life of the project. And finally, and this one's always very tricky, can we start to think about ways to incentivize researchers to come back and update their DMPs from the initial outline that they have to produce? So I think, Deanna, maybe I will stop sharing here, and if you want to go for coffee.
Yeah, I suggest we do stop for a 10-minute coffee break. Maybe leave the questions on screen for people who want to reflect about this. And I'll put the link to the Jamboard. And there are two questions that we need to address that are in the chat for when we return. So we mustn't forget to address those two questions as well. Okay, so let's take that coffee break. It's 11, let's say 25. So let's come back at 11:35. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Back at 11:35. I'm putting this in the chat for everybody. Okay, let's have a cup of coffee break and a cup of coffee and think about the questions. Okay, see you in a bit. Okay, starting recording again. So following Joy's talk, we're just going to go into discussion. There were a couple of questions before we talk about Joy's questions. Okay. The first was a comment from Nina, which I'm going to read. I don't know if it had a question in there. My understanding is that a safe haven is another term for TRE. Our current TRE is known as the data safe haven, but TRE is the genetic terminology for it. We do sometimes archive them long term if they can't be openly shared, though it's primarily data storage during a project for sensitive data. Nina, were you this is a comment. You weren't expecting any answer on this. I don't know if there's a subtext question in there or you were sharing experience. So if you wanted to add anything else, please go ahead. You ask a question after that. You say, how are safe havens different from TRE? Are they archives?
Yeah, I think I believe they're the same as the different terms for the same thing. So a trusted research environment and a safe haven are technically, I think, used in the same context. Whether they store archive longer term, like some examples, I think is down to the individual environment.
Yeah. Apologies for not expanding on this. So TRE equals trusted research environment. Joy, you had already answered that in the chat, but it's good for everybody. Okay, there was another question. There was another question. I'm pretty sure I saw another question from, okay, Joachim. Sometimes maybe generalist repositories, for example, from the GREI collaboration, may strike higher on the interoperability of metadata of FAIR than narrow institutional domain-specific repositories. I have to say I didn't follow this question. Joachim, would you mind explaining a little, because I didn't understand it. Apologies.
Yeah, I've already got an answer from Joy that may be true sometime. What I'm thinking about those, you know, the gray collaboration with Figshare, Zenodo, OSF, and other repositories, and it appears to me that they have started to converge on the latest version of DataSite 4.4, which means that they will be more interoperable than. I mean, it's perfectly true that you can have institutional repositories that also conform to accepted metadata standard. For example, here at Stockholm University, we have the Bolin climate database, which also can export in DataSite format. But maybe that's not always the case if you have built from scratch a small institutional repository, or some domain repositories may have domain-specific repositories may have only later adopted common metadata standards. And also, I think there's a point which I did not mention, that general repositories might also strike higher on the findability aspect. I mean, they are correspond in a way to what Nature and Science are as scientific journals. They are more cross-disciplinary. And I think that's a positive aspect, being a partisan of cross-disciplinary research. So I think you have to weigh those things together when you finally decide what repository you should use for making it maximally fair, your data.
I think that's a really good point. I think all of these things are general guidelines, and you have to kind of work with them to work out what's best for you. If you know a key aim of your project is to support interdisciplinarity, then using a very narrow domain-specific repository probably isn't the right approach. It might be for the curation of the data set. But yeah, there has to be kind of a broader understanding of what you're trying to achieve. So completely agree. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Who has questions? Sorry, Nina, go ahead.
It's in
okay.
as opposed, because my cursor vanished. Sorry, so I think in a way Joachim and I were on the same question, although it sounded very different. I was just reflecting from a very specific situation where, you know, we've always gone, oh, well, there's the clinical data over there, and then there's our data over here, and that's fine. They're in separate tracks, and they've got their own regulations, and no problem. We're never going to encounter this. Well,
Yeah.
you know, so it is a question then of having, you know, where the overlap is fine, it's fine. But in sometimes we're literally looking at different, if it's just additional, again, no problem. And I think what we don't talk about enough is that you can place things in more than one repository.
Yeah.
And at the end, that's kind of, but I was wondering, because sometimes some of the requirements were in fact opposing. And the requirement that the repository, the NHS repository, isn't trustworthy. In us, probably more trustworthy than most of our trustworthy repositories. But the NHS clinical trials management system, the European clinical trials management system, talks not at all to any of the FAIR requirements.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, this ongoing debate about what trustworthy means in a practical sense is a live debate, and everybody's got different views on what that means and what kinds of evidence can be used to support it. I think we're in the FAIR Impact Project, it's one of the things we're looking at, and we're kind of moving towards the idea of transparency. So let people make up their own minds about whether they think something is trustworthy, but what kind of elements do we need to expose about the service to make them be able to do that? I think the point about finding things in different repositories is great. You can, you know, I wouldn't want to have copies of the data in lots of different repositories unless they were very clearly stated that this is a copy of this. But I think metadata descriptions could be added to more than one repository and point to the data held somewhere else, and that kind of thing could work. The other thing that's happening, there is work to try and harmonize data catalogs, and I think DCAT has been, you know, cited for a while as being a potential way to do this. It works to certain levels of granularity. It's how you then kind of move beyond that into something, and DDI, CDI has been explored as an option. So there's ongoing discussions between the different repositories as to how they can allow people to search across different repositories. It's still a work in progress, but that's ultimately, you know, where we'd like to get to. And part of the European Open Science Cloud is trying to support this kind of view as well. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else in the question, I mean, I just thought we could take a few minutes to move to the Jamboard if people want to follow the link, and I can share my screen. It's essentially just the same as Miroboard, only Google, so you can add sticky notes by clicking on the sticky note icon, and my screen is taking a little longer to show, but you should then get the chance to write down a note and you can add it. So I just wanted to kind of open up the floor to discussion to think about, I've gone specifically for funded research since I think it's easier to talk about that in the context of DMPs with the time we have. Are there any trigger points that you can think of? I mean, I've put a couple in here that are tied to the DMP already. So there's the proposal stage, initial DMP that people have to write. And then there's the wrap up. So at some point, people probably come back and try to wrap up, or maybe they don't at the end of the project, maybe as final reporting. But when I was looking at the new research outputs tab within DMPonline, for me, it kind of opened up a lot of possibilities as to how we might be able to add certain elements to that and maybe consider it a sort of a living inventory of selected research items, and just wanted to see if other people had ideas of things that we might be able to do. So I think the point here, yeah, at the end of work packages, yeah, that can be a good one, because sometimes the work packages don't run the full length of a project. They might have different start and end phases, so that could be a good trigger point. When and if the data is offered for storage, I think that's a really good idea. And at the start of the DMP process, you might indicate that there's a potential repository that you want to use. And then when you get to this stage where you have the research outputs tab, yeah, it would be great if there could be a trigger in there that maybe allows people to say, I'm ready to upload. Can I get some help to do this kind of thing? Trying to see what other people have been. Publication of DMPs. I think, yes, definitely we're moving on to the incentives of DMPs. I think publication is a good option. And, you know, one of the things I've often wondered is whether we should be providing DOIs for end stage DMPs within DMPonline as a way to provide that sort of, here's what we did rather than here's what we plan to do. So something that you could publish and it could be linked to the outputs and provide additional context. I think that could be a nice additional citable output. I think the end of grant reporting definitely is, I'm not sure it's much of an incentive, but it's certainly something people have to be worried about. And I think, again, if we were looking at the research outputs tab and maybe creating the functionality to have a living inventory, if you like, so that people could start working on a data set that's maybe not published. I think that the difficulty with the research output tab as it is now, it kind of is looking at things once they're out there and ready to be shared. So if we could build in some functionality where people can highlight things that are coming and then move towards the ability to say, now I'm ready to share, and then again, maybe be able to pull that information back in from the repository that published it, that might be quite interesting. So seeing other things here, when submitting publications and when preparing for publication, yeah, I think that is really great. Again, if we're focusing on reproducibility, that could be a good chance to come back and look at this. I didn't mention fairness assessment tools in my talk, but there is a plethora of different tools that you could use as data stewards working with researchers to try and assess the fairness of the output, maybe before it goes to publication. One of the limitations on some of these tools at the moment is that they tend to require a DOI or some other sort of persistent identifier to be able to work. So it kind of is that chicken and egg. Can you do it before you publish? So pre-assessments is one of the things that we have been talking about in some of the European projects, and whether we can make that happen. So I'm starting to see quite a few things here. If anybody else wants to unmute and raise a point, I'm happy to hear from anybody else while I read what we're seeing here. Managing new collaborations. I think that is a good example. I think especially when you're starting to think about what you're bringing to the table and what your partners are bringing, DMPs can be a good way to do that and to manage expectations. I think particularly when you're working with commercial partners, it can often be a good way to clarify what they're not willing to share more broadly and to manage expectations that way. So I think, Nina, you've got your hand raised.
Sorry. It's nice because the DMPonline functions as my professional community a bit. We've been advocating within the SRC, and I think if anyone's UK here or UKRI, that there really does need to be money, the same as there's money to write up paper, that there's money for data curation. And it doesn't have to be a large amount of money or time, but that perhaps you can buy out somebody for a term, semester teaching in order to do write-up data curation, that there needs to be help with data, because that whole process is very cumbersome. And we've always said that that's one of the stopping points. So an updated DMP and a write-up for data curation attached to a reasonable amount of money for a month or two would be a very good place, I think, to do that. If we could advocate for that within the research councils, if anyone here wants to start a march.
Yeah, I think, some of the funders, we're lucky here in the UK and in Europe that a lot of curation activities can be costed into your grant, but it's knowing that when you're writing the proposal and being able to know that this is something you want to do. I like the idea of, publishing something at the end. And if we could make DMPonline do that in a really easy way where you can kind of rejig what you've done and have a kind of published DMP. Something that makes it easy would be a really nice incentive, because then they don't have to do much work and then they get this nice kind of citable output. But if we can build that in and make sure it's something that people think of and get costed in, that'd be great. But I do also think we need to do more work to get more funders to, to stump up. So that's great. So I think, Chris, you've got your hand up too.
I'm going to look at this from a slightly different tangent, and this might be outside of the scope of the specific discussion here, but I think it's worth just considering one extra point, and it comes out of your third good question on the slide about incentivizing researchers. And we can lead a horse to water, but we can't always make them drink.
Yeah.
There are lots of incentives, funder reporting requirements where they exist, policies, appeal to good research practice, and so on, and benefits like end of project reporting. But generally, researchers, in my experience, don't particularly like administrative burden, and often if they're inputting the same information into multiple systems. And that made me think, can organizations take the administrative burden off the researchers? And what I'm wondering about is the possibility of creating write APIs so that organizations can write metadata into DMPonline on behalf of their researchers. And this would allow, for example, organizations to harvest the relevant metadata about their data sets and so on from both their internal systems, like their research information system, and if they did the legwork, from external systems like DataCite or initiatives like Make Data Count, and actually push that metadata into DMPonline. Now, the key to that approach, I think, will be to find identifiers that map across the different systems. For example, our research information system, we actually record the DMP IDs. Now, at the moment, they're not PIDs, it's just the URL, but perhaps in future, if we start to mint DOIs for DMPs, then that's a better way to go. And perhaps a key for this might be the RAID identifier as a project PID that might unlock use of APIs to push the metadata on behalf of our researchers into DMPonline. I'm not suggesting one way or the other. I'm looking at a mix of solutions. It's another strand. Can we use write APIs for bulk automated upload into DMPonline to complement manual inputs by the researchers themselves? So that was my extra thought.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really great way to go. I think you're right. People, even if they see the benefit of having another citable output, don't want to do extra work. So if we can make it easy within the system to do that, and by better APIs where we can pull in information from more places, that should help. I like the idea of, can we identify things that will be selected outputs and make that clear as early on as possible. And then it's kind of the research data steward can do that checking up on whatever time scale is right for you to say, have you, how's this going? Is it going to a repository? And for that to work, I think we would need to have the ability to log something other than a DOI. So whether, it's a RAID or a local URL, I think the ability to log that within maybe a table view could be great, and then you can update it as you go, and then you get that kind of picture from start to end. For me, I kind of always think of it as an inventory of things, and that just makes it easier for the research team as well to be able to say, well, this is what you said you were going to produce, tick, 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 it's all where it's supposed to be. So for me, I think it's got benefits for the research data stewards, and I do like the idea. I can only really think within the current structure of DMPonline, if you were co-owners of the plan, and that comes down, I guess, to whether you wanted to push that angle with your researchers to make you that co-owner and then allow you to be able to add metadata. So that could be a conversation worth having, but I don't know if other people, I see a couple of other hands, so maybe I can move on to, but thank you. I think that's an excellent idea. And I think what we're hoping for is that this is a starting point. So we'll maybe come back to some of these later on. They won't get solved today, but thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks, Joe.
So, I don't know if any of the other two hands I see, I can't say who the hands belong to. So if maybe we've got about 3 minutes left, I think. So we can maybe take one question.
It's Nina.
Yeah.
Again.
Oh, hey, Nina.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Nina.
Okay.
But is there somebody else who wants to speak?
No, sorry, I didn't mean to say as in. So it's Nina, as in you. You didn't leave your.
Oh, okay. So
your hand raised.
I'll just say very quickly. One of the other issues for updating DMPs is the sense is a problem again. Number one, definitely, I feel we need to say to our funders that there needs to be specific allocated funding and time to this project, even if it is automated. But the other is there's a fear of not having done the DMP the way it was originally done. And sometimes people don't update DMPs precisely because of that box situation. And they don't want to show that there's been change, even though we in our profession might say we expect change. Yeah. And I think that also, again, maybe from the funder or maybe what Chris is talking about, is if we specifically build in to the project the concept of change. So we specifically build in what has changed from your original.
Yeah.
And normalize that change will happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a fear, I always kind of equate it to a DMP is like writing a project proposal. I can write a great proposal, get the money, and then people can just assume I've done what I said. A DMP is the same in my mind. You've kind of written a great pitch, but you have to come back and change. And just as, in projects, things don't always go to plan. I've never been in a project that has gone 100% to plan. And there's always good reasons. You justify why things change. I think we have to make that mind shift happen, that you're not going to come up with the magic plan at the outset and you just stick to it. It's really about adapting as things change and demonstrating that you're prepared to change your course if that is determined to be the right thing to do. So I think there is some culture changing that we still have to do on that for sure. But I am aware now it is 12 o'clock and I know everybody's very busy and they have lunch to grab and maybe other meetings to go to, but I will just stop sharing my screen now. And I wanted to say thank you very much for everybody who's taken the time to listen to me go on about FAIR data today, and to take the time to add your suggestions. What we'll do is a little bit of analysis on what people have had. We'll do a little cleaning up with the board. Feel free to add to it over the next couple of days if you want. And maybe for the next user group meeting, we'll try to share the clean results and think about how we can start to take some of these things and progress with it. So I think that's all for me. I'll maybe hand back to you, Deanna, in case there's anything that you wanted to say before the end.
Yeah, very quickly, I just want to say that we'll circulate the recording of the session, the video recording of the session, as we always do, share the slides with you. We have forthcoming, just wanted to let you know, forthcoming events. So the next user group meeting is 19th of March, and we'll look at sub-elements of the user interface. And then there's also the workshop on interoperability on 19th of February. As part of the International Digital Curation Conference. So you can register that from the DCC website. And I'm just gonna send you the very generic link at this stage, so you can follow the links from the IDCC program. And when you register for the workshop, it's free to attend. When you register for the workshop, you'll be automatically taken to a waiting list, because at the moment we're still establishing the capacity of the room and how many people we can accommodate. And that's all. Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for attending. We'll be in touch.